Southeast Washington, D.C., 1987. A man named Tony Kenyon is walking through the 3300 block of 14th Place. He is 29 years old. He doesn't make it to the end of the block. Someone shoots him in the chest. He dies on the street. The shooter is not a grown man with a reputation built over years. The shooter is a teenager, a boy so young that when D.C. detectives start building the case, pulling witnesses, running the name, tracing the weapon, they keep coming back to the same detail that stops them cold. How old? Later that same year, December 6th, another man is killed. Matthew Blake, shot dead during a gunfight on Camden Street Southeast. Same name comes back. Same teenager. In May of the following year, a third shooting. Levin Hill survived. Assault with intent to kill. Same name. Then Prince George's County, December 1988. A man named Andre Smith, shot dead at the Crystal Skate Rink on Branch Avenue. Murder and rape charges filed. Same name. 4 separate incidents. 4 separate jurisdictions. 4 separate cases building simultaneously against one person. That person is not a gang leader, not a kingpin with an organization behind him, not a man with decades of street experience who has built up to this level of violence gradually. He is a teenager from Berry Farm, Southeast D.C., a boy the streets call Shorty Pop. And here is the detail that makes this story unlike anything else in Washington, D.C.'s history. While the police were building those 4 cases, while the bodies were stacking up across Southeast and Prince George's County, while D.C. detectives were pulling warrants and issuing bench warrants and trying to locate a teenager who had accumulated more criminal exposure in 2 years than most men manage in a lifetime, the record label Def Jam was preparing to release music by his band. The same boy, the same Berry Farm streets, a Def Jam recording artist, and a murder suspect in 4 separate jurisdictions simultaneously. This is the story of Shelton Watkins. The streets called him Shorty Pop. Southeast Washington, D.C. sits across the Anacostia River from the Capitol Dome, 2 miles. That is the distance between the most powerful government building in the world and one of the most underserved public housing projects in America. Berry Farm, built in the 1860s as housing for formerly enslaved people freed during the Civil War. Originally a community of self-sufficient black homeowners who had purchased their own land. Over the following century, as public housing policy reshaped the neighborhood, it became something different. Government towers rose on Stanton Road, Wade Road, and Knox Place in the heart of Southeast. By the 1970s, Berry Farm was already under pressure from disinvestment, underfunded schools, and an economy with narrow doors for the people who grew up there. Shelton Watkins grew up inside all of that. But he also grew up watching something that existed nowhere else in America: go-go music, a hybrid of funk, soul, and percussion that D.C. had developed as its own specific sound, with the godfather of go-go, Chuck Brown, building something in Southeast and Northeast that the rest of the country could not replicate because you had to be from D.C. to fully understand what it was expressing. In Berry Farm, children who could not afford instruments found another way. Hubcaps beaten with sticks, plastic buckets upside down, metal crates, empty cans, discarded pots and pans scavenged from the neighborhood. In 1980, a group of children from Berry Farm, ranging from 8 to 13 years old, started playing these improvised instruments at informal performances in the neighborhood. Locals called them the Junkyard Band. Shelton Watkins was the lead singer, 8 years old, 9 years old, singing in a band of children playing garbage on Berry Farm streets. That is where this story starts. Not on a corner, not with a weapon, playing junk. The band kept playing. Through the early 1980s, as the children of Berry Farm grew older and the Junkyard Band developed from an informal neighborhood performance into something more organized, Shelton Watkins grew up alongside it. But Southeast Washington, D.C., in the early 1980s, was not just a place where go-go music was developing, it was a war zone. The crack cocaine epidemic that would eventually turn Washington, D.C. into the murder capital of America was building block by block through Southeast. The money it generated was visible in ways that nothing legitimate in Berry Farm had ever been visible. Cars, jewelry, cash that moved through the neighborhood like weather, appearing suddenly, disappearing suddenly, always connected to the men willing to do what the money required. Shelton Watkins watched it. He watched the men who had it. He watched what they did to get it and what they did to keep it. He watched what happened to the men who challenged them and what happened to the men who served them. And he made a calculation. Not impulsively, not in the heat of some single transformative moment. A calculation. He stepped into the street life as a hitter, not a dealer building a corner, not a runner moving product for someone else's organization, not someone working his way up through a hierarchy. A hitter. The specific role in the underground economy that required one thing above everything else: the willingness to do what other people could not. In a world where violence was currency, where the credible threat of it was what made organizations function and territories hold, a man who could be counted on to handle the most extreme problems was worth more than almost anyone else. Violence as currency changed the math of value in the streets. Shorty Pop discovered early that this was what he was built for. Not reluctantly, not after a period of trying other options and finding them closed. He was built for this the way some people are built for music. The specific combination of fearlessness and calm and the ability to make decisions under pressure that would freeze most people, it came to him naturally, built for it, from the start. Southeast D.C. in the early 1980s was a proving ground. Every block had its hierarchy. Every corner had its politics. Every dispute had consequences that could escalate faster than most teenagers could process. Shorty Pop processed them instantly. He moved through Southeast with the specific authority of someone who the streets had already decided was not to be tested. Not because he was the biggest, not because he had the most people behind him, because of what he was willing to do. And what he was willing to do at an age when most of his peers were still figuring out what the game was, had already made his name mean something in Southeast Washington, D.C. By 15, the streets called him Shorty Pop. And Shorty Pop was already one of the most feared people in Chocolate City. Not feared the way a neighborhood is feared, the way bad weather is feared. Feared the way a specific person is feared, the way that makes men who are themselves dangerous speak a name carefully. At 15 years old, 1985, Southeast Washington, D.C. A man named Alberto Martinez is in the city. He is not from D.C. He is from East Harlem, the same streets that had produced Rich Porter, the same world that would eventually become the paid-in-full mythology that defined a generation of hip-hop culture. Alpo was building, a cocaine operation moving product from New York into the nation's capital, looking for infrastructure, looking for people who knew D.C. in the way that only people from D.C. could know it. The streets, the politics, the specific geography of power in Southeast and Northeast, and the corridors where product moved and money changed hands. He needed people he could trust. In Southeast D.C., trust was earned through one thing: what you were willing to do. Someone brought Alpo to a corner where a 15-year-old from Berry Farm was operating. The meeting was not planned. Not arranged through layers of introduction the way business meetings work. It happened the way things happen in that world, organically, through proximity, through the specific gravity that draws people who operate at extreme levels toward each other. Alpo looked at Shorty Pop, 15 years old, small. The name literally described his stature, Shorty. And what Alpo saw in this teenager from Berry Farm was something that surprised him. Not size, not age, not any of the external qualities that men in that world normally use to evaluate other men. He saw what DC already knew. This boy had no fear of consequences, not the recklessness that comes from not understanding danger, something different and more unsettling, the specific quality of a person who understood exactly what the consequences were and had decided they did not matter. Alpo later described the meeting in words that have circulated through DC street legend ever since. Through Pop, a young wild 15-year-old coming out of Southeast DC, killing anything moving, I met the cat, Wayne. Wayne Perry. That sentence contains the entire story of what Shorty Pop was at 15 years old. Killing anything moving. Not a metaphor, not street exaggeration. Alpo Martinez, a man who built one of the most violent drug organizations in DC history, who himself ordered and facilitated murders, who the streets of New York and DC feared in ways that most men never achieve, described a 15-year-old from Berry Farm with the specific AWE that men who deal in violence reserve for people who are genuinely extraordinary at it. Pop introduced Alpo to Wayne Perry, and that introduction, made by a 15-year-old boy who had started a go-go band at 8 years old on Berry Farm streets, changed Washington, D.C. forever. Wayne Perry was already something DC talked about carefully. The streets called him Silk, not because he was smooth, in the way the nickname implies for most people, because his violence was smooth, efficient, without hesitation or drama. The kind of violence that other violent men described with the vocabulary of craft, the way a surgeon might describe a difficult procedure, or a boxer might describe a perfect combination. Wayne Perry did not perform violence. He administered it. He had grown up in D.C., had been doing time for murder when Alpo arrived from New York, was sitting in a D.C. jail cell, and nobody was coming. Not his crew, not the people he had put in work for, not the men who had benefited from his specific willingness to do what other people could not. Nobody came. The people who were supposed to come up with bail money decided the calculation did not work in their favor. They left Wayne Perry in that cell. Alpo heard about it. He went to the jail, put up the money, bailed Wayne Perry out. When Perry walked out of that jail cell, he made a decision about what Alpo's loyalty was worth. He became Alpo's enforcer, and the DC cocaine trade shifted overnight. Because the thing about Wayne Perry, the thing that made DC Police Commander Donald Hilbring eventually describe him as the most dangerous man the department had ever encountered, was not just that he was willing to use violence. It was that he was willing to use it anywhere, at any time, against anyone. There was no location that made Perry hesitate, no time of day, no public setting, no level of visibility that made him calculate differently. He walked up to men in broad daylight, in crowded areas, on streets with witnesses, and he did what he came to do and walked away. The story that circulated through D.C. captures it precisely: a dispute over a corner. A New York dealer telling a young kid from Alpo's crew that he could not hustle in his spot. Alpo and Perry both present. Perry telling the kid to go back to the corner and stand his ground. As soon as the New York dealer came back around, Perry stepped out from beside a building and shot him in the head with everything he had in the clip, then walked away. When police arrived, Perry came back in different clothes just to watch, to see who was talking to the cops. That was Wayne Perry, a man who killed and then returned to watch the aftermath out of curiosity. Alpo's operation moved 30 kilograms per day at peak. 30 kilograms per day. Nobody touched it, because touching Alpo meant touching silk. And that calculation, the specific arithmetic of what it would cost to challenge a man who had Wayne Perry at his side, made Alpo untouchable in a city that was itself one of the most violent in America. All of it started with Shorty Pop, a 15-year-old boy making an introduction before he was old enough to vote. Here is where the story becomes something that no screenwriter could invent. Because while Shorty Pop was building his street reputation, while the bodies were accumulating, and while the DC detectives were building their cases, the Junkyard Band was climbing. The same years, the same streets, the same Berry Farm, two completely separate trajectories running simultaneously inside one human being. On one side, the music. The Junkyard Band had grown from informal neighborhood performances into something that the broader DC go-go scene was paying serious attention to. They had developed their sound, the percussion-heavy call and response energy that made go-go a specific gift to American music. They were playing larger venues, attracting larger audiences, and moving from Berry Farm streets into the DC music ecosystem that was generating real commercial interest from outside the city. Def Jam came calling. Def Jam in the mid-1980s was the most important hip-hop label in America. It was founded by Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons in 1984. LL Cool J, the Beastie Boys, run DMC. It was the institution that was taking hip-hop from a New York underground phenomenon into a global commercial force. Def Jam signed the Junkyard Band. Children from the Berry Farm Housing Project, who had started making music on hubcaps and plastic buckets because they had no other instruments, signed to the most important hip-hop label in the world. Their songs, Sardines and The Word, were recorded and released. Shelton Watkins, Shorty Pop, lead singer of the original lineup on Def Jam Records. On the other side, the streets. While the Junkyard Band was recording with Def Jam, DC Metropolitan Police detectives were accumulating cases against the lead singer. 1987. Tony Kenyon shot dead on 14th Place. Shelton Walker wanted for murder. December of the same year. Matthew N. Blake killed in a shootout on Camden Street. Same name on the warrant. May of the following year. Levin Hill shot on Georgia Avenue. Assault with intent to kill. Same name. December 1988. Andre Smith murdered at the Crystal Skate Rink in Prince George's County. Murder and rape charges filed. A bench warrant issued for failure to appear. 4 jurisdictions. 4 separate sets of charges. Murder. Assault with intent to kill. Rape. The same person who was listed as a recording artist on a Def Jam release. The same person who had started a band at 8 years old playing hubcaps on Berry Farm streets. Both things true simultaneously. The detectives building the cases against Shorty Pop and the label executives managing the Junkyard Band's career were operating in completely parallel universes, both of them organized around the same teenager from Southeast Washington, D.C., who existed fully in each world without either world fully containing him. That is the impossible contradiction that nobody has ever told properly about Shorty Pop. Not just that he was young and violent, not just that he was connected to Alpo and Wayne Perry, but that while all of that was happening, while the murder charges were stacking and the warrants were being issued and DC detectives were building a case file that would follow him for years, he was on Def Jam Records, Southeast Washington, D.C., Berry Farm. Today, the Junkyard Band is still active. 45 years after a group of children from Berry Farm started banging on hubcaps and plastic buckets on the streets of Southeast Washington, D.C., the band still plays. It still carries the specific sound of DC go-go that they helped define. It still performs across the city and beyond. Their Wikipedia page lists Shorty Pop as a past member, lead singer, original lineup. That is the only official public record that connects Shelton Watkins to something that most people would call positive. One line on a Wikipedia page, lead singer, original lineup. Against that one line, 4 murder cases, multiple assault charges, warrants across 2 jurisdictions, a bench warrant for failure to appear, a son who grew up without him. His son, who spoke publicly in a 40-minute interview about his father, described what it meant to grow up carrying that name in Southeast Washington, D.C. Not the famous son of a famous man, not the child of someone whose legacy was celebrated, the son of a legend that D.C. told in 2 different voices. In one voice, the street legend, Shorty Pop. The 15-year-old who Alpo Martinez described as killing anything moving. The boy who introduced 2 of the most feared men in D.C. history to each other. The hitter who built a reputation before most teenagers had their first job. In another voice, the musician, the lead singer, the child who banged on a hubcap at 8 years old and made something beautiful from what Berry Farm discarded. His son inherited both versions of the name, both versions of the legacy, both versions of the weight that comes from being the child of someone the streets remember, but the law never fully resolved. His father had been murdered. The specific circumstances, like so much of Shorty Pop's story, live in the oral history of Southeast Washington, D.C., rather than in any official public record. No arrest publicly recorded, no trial, no verdict. Just the knowledge, passed down through Berry Farm, through Southeast, through the go-go community that remembered Shelton Watkins as both a singer and a shooter, that he was gone, and what he left behind. Not property, not money, not a legitimate legacy that his son could point to. The knowledge that his father had been 2 things simultaneously that the world usually insists are mutually exclusive: a musician and a killer, both real, both Berry Farm, both the same boy who started making music from garbage at 8 years old and was dead before he turned 30. The crack era in Washington, D.C. killed an entire generation, not metaphorically. In 1990, Washington, D.C. recorded 472 murders in a city of 600,000 people, a murder rate that put it at the top of every list of the most violent cities in America. The boys who came of age in Berry Farm and Southeast and Northeast during those years faced a set of options that most Americans never had to navigate. Go-go music was one option, the streets were another. Shelton Watkins chose both, not sequentially, not first one, then the other, both simultaneously. A Def Jam recording artist and a murder suspect in 4 jurisdictions at the same time. The crack era did not ask the children who grew up inside it to choose one thing. It presented both doors simultaneously and let them walk through whichever one was open. Sometimes both doors were open at the same time. Shorty Pop walked through both and paid the price that the streets have always charged for the men who try to live in 2 worlds at once. The Junkyard Band is still playing. The charges against Shelton Walker are still in the D.C. or public record. His son is still carrying the name. And the introduction that a 15-year-old boy made on a Southeast D.C. corner in 1985, the moment that connected Alpo Martinez to Wayne Perry and changed the trajectory of Washington, D.C.'s most violent decade, remains the most consequential thing that Shorty Pop ever did before he could vote.